Stephen Church received his MFA at Colorado State University, and he attended the University of Kansas, where he received his BA in philosophy. This philosophical background makes its way into his writing, including his most recent book, Theoretical Killings, Essays, and Accidents. Church is the author of 2 other books, and his work has appeared widely in such journals as Fourth Genre, River Teeth, Quarterly West, Colorado Review, and many others. He's been nominated 6 times for the Pushcart Prize, and he received the Colorado Book Award for the Guinness Book of Me. Church's essay Auscultation was anthologized in Best American Essays 2011. He has work forthcoming in Fourth Genre and creative nonfiction, and you can look for a piece on Bear Grylls in the Evolutionary Review. Stephen Church currently teaches in the MFA program at California State University, Fresno, and is the founding editor of the literary magazine, The Normal School, like Pat has mentioned. He's described his own writing process as echolocation, as being similar to echolocation, and I feel that this is reflected in the lyrical logic of many of his essays. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Church.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Bess and Pat. Actually, Pat didn't tell the truth. We met because we were on the nonfiction basketball team. We're the tall essayist. No. Thanks for having me out today. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm happy to come and meet Pat's students. I've known him for a few years and published his work, and I'm a big fan of his book, Quotidiana. So it's great to be here. I'm going to read one short essay for you that was published in the online magazine Brevity, and then a couple of other essays. So this piece is called Lag Time. It doesn't thunderstorm in California. Not like those from my memory of home. I listen for them at night when the sky half promises, but it rarely delivers the noise I need. This I know. If you count the time it takes between the flash of a Kansas lightning bolt and the crack before the roll and peal of thunder, if you time the lag, Dad would say, you can tell how close you are to the lightning. He and I often lingered in the pre-storm beneath the green soup sky, dwelling in the pause between cause and effect. The neighbors, too. All of us gawking at our potential demise, counting intervals between what was and what will be. And if there's an objective measure of a split second, it would have to be close to the time between the flash of intimate lightning and the sound of its ear-stunning crack, a noise that tingles up from your toes and ripples through your belly, a sound the body hears before the ears. Or maybe it is similar to that time I sat on a porch swing at the lake and heard the lodge dinner bell ring itself, the clapper vibrating like an ear bone, a split second after a flash and strike to the metal tower. Or the time between a blue racquetball's jump off the wall and the sound of its impact, or the gap between when your ear hears a noise in the house at night and the second your brain registers it as normal and safe, the sound of a dog dreaming, the rattle of the refrigerator, or something different, maybe dangerous, the wheezing croup cough of your baby, the jiggling of a doorknob, a simple phone call in the middle of the night. Or perhaps a split second is a more subjective measurement, the tiny gap where I lose myself again and again in memory. Finally untethered, I drop this loss into the space between my father and me. I try to let go of that rip in his voice over the telephone almost 20 years ago and the interminable pause after the words rolled out. It's Matt, your brother. There was an accident. And just before the crack of the plastic phone settling into its cradle. Because in that lag, that brief second between what he said and the impact of what it meant, it was possible that things would always sound the same between us. Okay, So the next piece I'm going to read to you is the piece that Bess mentioned, Auscultation, which is in this magazine called The Pedestrian, which sadly only printed 2 issues, the first of which Pat was in, the second of which I was in, and then it folded. I don't know if that's if we're responsible for that. But I found the magazine actually because I had read Pat's piece in it, and I saw the mag, and I thought, oh, that seems like a neat magazine. I like what they're doing. So I sent them this piece. I think it was after the deadline even. And it's called Auscultation. Auscultation, Chamber 1. In August 2007, we all waited to hear news of 6 miners trapped 1,500 feet underground by a massive cave-in at the Crandall Canyon coal mine in Utah. A catastrophic collapse so intense that it registered a 3.9 magnitude earthquake on seismographs. As rescuers began the arduous 3-day process of digging the men out, they also erected seismic listening devices on the surface and set off 3 dynamite charges, a signal to any surviving miners to make noise, lots of noise. The electronic ears listened for the sound of hammers pounding on the rock and on roof bolts, the telltale rap and thump of human life. We listened and listened, but never heard a thing. 6 miners missing, 6 boreholes drilled into different areas of the mine. They sent oxygen sensors, cameras, and microphones down through PVC pipe, fishing in each hole, searching every possible area for the men. Oxygen levels were misread, confused, and ultimately determined to be dangerously low. 3 rescuers working, trying to dig the trapped miners out, were also killed when a wall of the mine explodes, crushing them. We never heard or saw any sign of the miners, and all 6 men were considered missing and presumed dead. All rescue efforts were eventually abandoned. I don't know if there's a signal for this, another series of blasts to say goodbye, or some other ceremonial end to the search. Maybe they just switch off the drills and unplug their ears. The owner of the mine, Bob Murray, held a press conference and said, "Had I known that this evil mountain, this alive mountain, would do what it did, I would never have sent the miners in there. I'll never go near that mountain again." Finally, a 7th hole was bored into the mountain, and through this hole they pumped thousands of gallons of mud and debris, filling all remaining cavities and sealing the tomb off permanently with the missing miners still inside. Researchers today at Utah State University are working to create more effective listening and noise-making devices to help trapped miners, some of them seemingly crude and simplistic, yet effective. One plan calls for 4 by 4 inch iron plates to be placed at regular intervals in the tunnels, with sledgehammers kept nearby. The idea being that a trapped miner can find his way to a station and slam the hammer into the iron plate over and over again. Think of the noise below. Think of your ears. Geophones on the surface, the kind of sensors they use to anticipate earthquakes, would register the sound waves created by the hammer pings and create a listening grid, a kind of sound map of the mine, which they would then use to pinpoint the exact location of any miners still kicking below the rugged skin. Chamber 2. Recall the ice-cold press of the metal disc against your cavity, the sting and soft burn as it warms your clavicle, your breastbone, fingers moving metal across your naked chest, around behind, fingertips stepping down your spine, one hand on your hip, maybe your shoulder, the other sliding around your rib cage, always, always with the whispered command, breathe, breathe, good. And the eyes staring not at you, but at the cold diaphragm, the metallic spot on your body, listening as if your body possesses a voice of its own and speaks in a language only others understand. The diaphragm will only broadcast its secret to the touch. It knows you, and when it touches you, it sings sounds of your body, noises you can barely imagine, the hypnotic pump of organs, the soft ebb and flow of blood in your veins, and the breathy whisper of lungs at work. Noises that can name you normal, healthy, or not. The intimate instrument, the stethoscope, knows your body in a way your own hands and ears never can. Chamber 3. Some heart doctors train their ears on classical music, Mozart and Bach and Chopin, learning to discern the individual instruments, to hear baritone from trombone, trumpet from sax, and the tum-tum of kettle over bongo or bass. They learn to listen for the flaws and failings of the heart, to recognize the music of machine-like muscle efficiency, and to understand when a noise is a bad noise. They depend on the stethoscope for more than diagnoses. They need it to be whole. Nothing promises doctor like a stethoscope draped around an exposed neck or curled over a pressed collared shirt, perhaps tucked neatly into the pocket of a white lab coat, or clutched firmly in hand, authoritatively, like a craftsman hammer, a plumber's seat wrench, or a surgeon's scalpel, the only tool for a specific job. You are familiar with the flexible latex tubing, the chrome-plated ear tubes, the hard metal diaphragm, cold, round, smooth as pearl, reflective as a mirror. The stethoscope immediately identifies a doctor, an icon of care and pain management, a reliquary of body knowledge, someone you trust with your life. Think of the things you've allowed another person to do and say to you, mainly because they wore the uniform of a doctor and carried a stethoscope. We don't check resumes or credentials, don't ask for service reviews or certificates. We expect and accept the object, even if it's never used, but it's always used. Its appearance conjures a sense memory of that repeated sweet burn when pressed to your flesh. Regardless of physical context or attire, say at a crowded beach, in a subway, or on a mountaintop, the stethoscope speaks. It says, "I am a doctor." And in so doing, it grants rights and responsibilities, obligations and expectations. It tells us you will do no harm. It tells us that you know what you're talking about. Every child's doctor playset comes with a plastic stethoscope because you can't dress up as a doctor without one. As object, it functions as both necessary and sufficient condition of doctorness. But this identity and image of the doctor as listener, as diviner of significant sounds through a stethoscope, a magician of auscultation, is a relatively new one, just over 150 years old. The French doctor René Laennec is credited by many for inventing the first stethoscope, or at least for introducing the diagnostic practice of auscultation. It wasn't until the 1851 invention by Arthur Lyrid and the refinement in 1852 by George Kamen of the binaural stethoscope, a simple but incredibly significant instrument, that the practice of refined auscultation began to develop, and doctors could listen in stereo to the sounds of the body. Before that, it was a crude monaural amplifying horn, the next ear trumpet, which offered little more than a distant thump against the rib cage. Without binaural stethoscope technology, auscultation was like listening for trees falling in a distant forest, or miners tapping faintly in a deep pit. But doctors still pressed ears to chest cavities and listened for the pings, trying to read the heart's noises and tremors. L.A. Conner, the founder of the American Heart Association, is said to have carried a silk handkerchief to place on the wall of the chest for ear auscultation. For 100 years, cardiologists relied on Kamen's binaural scope to detect the slightest abnormality, arrhythmia, skip, hop, hammer, block, or stutter. 1952 and 1964 saw further refinements of the traditional binaural stethoscope, with many cardiologists believing that the now all but obsolete Rappaport Sprague was the finest auscultation device ever made or used, allowing them unprecedented clarity and consistency. Current research is focused on developing a reliable electronic amplified stethoscope, which is not actually a listening device, but a noise translator that generates a reproduction of the heartbeat, bullying the human ear out of its place as the direct register of the heart. I first heard the whoosh, whoosh of my daughter's heart as a reproduction, an electronic transmission through a fetal heart monitor strapped to my wife's belly, an electronic stethoscope. The sound is less a thump than a slosh, more valve and flap than muscled push, but is still a treasured sound. For most of our prenatal visits, medical intervention extended only as far as placement of the fetal heart monitor. The first thing we did, doctor and parents, was listen. All together. We awaited the news of life, and anyone who's been in this place understands the simple comfort of that sound, the reassurance of that noise, or more directly, the doctor's recognition that this is normal noise. A baby's heartbeat is the first sensory experience a father has with his child, often the first moment that a father begins to think of the fetus as a child. A baby, body and brain and lungs and drumming hearts, an identity, the first hint of possibility filtered through an electronic translator, reproduced from a tiny speaker. Nothing promises person like these first heart sounds. Nothing says it begins like the wish, wish, wish noise of the stubborn pump. And I say this with both knowledge and ignorance of the ethical implications for some. Perhaps because of facts, stats, opinions, and ideas, or perhaps because I had no other way to feel my wife's pregnancy, fatherhood was mostly an abstraction. I never really began to feel like a baby's father until I heard the thumping inside, that telltale tapping. Or perhaps my son was not a son, my daughter not a daughter, at least in part, until their first heart noises registered in my ear. A formation of identity that wasn't even possible when my grandfather was born in 1906, or my father in 1945, and was still only a rough science when I was born in 1971. But I know that in many ways, I did not identify myself as a father until I heard my child's heart, and that I couldn't have heard this without the aid of a stethoscope. Most of us identify a doctor by the stethoscope, that intimate disc, but it also identifies parent and child. All three fledgling identities intertwine in that examination room, hopelessly dependent on the curl and twisting turns of simple listening technology, the only tool for the vital job of reading and feeling the rhythmic thumps of the heart, that tap, tap, tap signal of life we cannot see and I can in no other way sense. Chamber 4. The year is 2002, and 9 miners are trapped in the Q Creek mine in Pennsylvania by rising water released after a drilling machine punches through a wall into an underground spring. The 9 men, a father and son among the crew, retreat to the highest spot in the mine and rope themselves together. They listen for the signal from the surface, 3 small explosions, but don't hear anything. They start pounding on the roof bolts with their hammers, hoping to make some noise on the surface, noise the surface can recognize. They pound and pound, but background noise on the surface interferes, and the seismic listening devices can't hear them. The men write notes to family members, seal them in a metal lunchbox, and wait to die. As rescuers work frantically to pull water from the mine with massive diesel-powered pumps, they also drill down from the surface to pump oxygen into the cave where the rescuers hope the men have retreated. If the miners are alive, they can only be in one place, all of them protected by a small womb of air against the rising flood. The miners continue pounding on the roof bolts, but they get no response. The miners' families gather on the surface, huddled in a tent around the drill operator. Perhaps because he is more than an operator and more than muscle. He's more like the human side of the machine, the listening side, the man with the touch who watches the spin of metal waiting. When the drill finally reaches the lightless room, 240 feet down, and punches like an amnio needle into the pocket, the drill operator shuts off the machine, quiets the crowd, and listens. I wonder what it was he listened for. How faint, how rhythmic. He listens, his hands on the machine, until he finally hears or feels the rhythmic noise of the trapped men hammering at the steel, the sole musical evidence of survival. Above them, on the outside, the expectant wives and mothers rejoice. They hug the man at the drill and slap each other on the back and think of how they can't wait to see and touch and smell their babies again. Okay. So as you might have figured out, a lot of the stuff I've been working on is about sound. Both of those pieces, and another one that I had in fourth genre called Ultrasonic. I'm writing a lot about sound. This is another piece that deals with that as well, though slightly different. And this is called All of a Dither. It was in the magazine Agni. How do you pronounce that? Is it Agni? So I'll just go ahead and read this. It's called All of a Dither, and it begins with an epigraph. "Look out," squawked Mrs. Mallard, all of a dither. You'll get run over. Robert McCloskey, Make Way for Ducklings. An etymology of. The dithering of a grass, says the resurrected Wallace Stevens, while the stage manager was dithering in the wings. Faced with unpleasant choices, she merely dithers. She dithers on the phone, at the coffee pot, the water cooler, over donuts at church. But perhaps now is the perfect time for confusion and agitation, even while wild rumors of war dithered the population. Truthfully, the outbreak of war threw all parties into a dither. And here in the everyday theater, something has to be done about the birthrighter, our navigator and guide through this. Before the second baby arrives, he seems to be stuck in some kind of amniotic rut, some comfortable groove, a track of language and origins. He thinks he has things all figured out, thinks their family of 3 runs like a machine most of the time, all the gauges reading normal, and he's wondering why they need another. But in his head now, with his second baby coming, the newly resurrected Mr. Stevens keeps repeating the dithering of the grass, the dithering of the grass, the dithering of the grass, until the navigator, shaken out of his own nervous tizzy, drops the curtain, and Stevens, rising unsteadily from his stool, wobbles and teeters around on stage, moved, it seems, by words and mumbled stage directions. Our navigator, lost in the lights, can only vacillate between choices, essaying in his head one path or the other, dithering on the page until the applause subsides, and poor Wallace Stevens keels forward into the orchestra pit, exhausting his potential, an air of narration that frightens the audience into a rolling wave of panic and sends them scrambling, the energy, the audience's fear and confusion multiplying and expanding until the gold-crusted room is engorged with emotion and people press against the exits, stepping over some and on top of others, bursting through the doors out into the rain-wet streets, quivering with bodies. And everywhere is the trembling, bandy-legged noise of new birth, escape, and raw salvation. First knowledge of. Before our children make a noise, before my daughter becomes the doughy, loose-limbed, and soft-skulled thing I can touch and hold and smell, her sweet, milky odor, the cheesy stink of her skin folds, the powdery scent of her head, I can know her body only in pictures painted through sound, pictures that look reptilian and warped, bones glowing white beneath transparent flesh. It's difficult to feel like a father from those pictures. Before she walks, I can know the ripple and flutter of her kicks. Before she makes a noise, her first voice is the wish, wish, wish of her heartbeat, filtered through an electronic stethoscope. Before she sees me make words, she knows the sound of my voice, the rumble of my baritone, the rattle of my cough, even the low growl of my snores at night. Before perhaps she's even developed ears, she resonates sound in her bones and tissue, her whole body trembling like a tuning fork to the everyday noise of our lives. The howling of passing trains, the white noise of the 180 and 41 freeways, barking dogs, the nightly oscillating drone of the police helicopters, and on better nights, the soft sounds of her brother reading to his mother's belly, talking into the button, his voice vibrating through the amniotic drum. But I wonder how I will register her arrival, how she will rattle my gauges. A history of. Airplane bombers use mechanical computers to perform navigation and bomb trajectory calculations. Curiously, these computers, boxes filled with hundreds of gears and cogs, performed more accurately when flying on board the aircraft and less well on ground. Engineers realized that the vibration from the aircraft reduced the air from sticky moving parts. Instead of moving in short jerks, they moved more continuously. Small vibrating motors were built into the computers, and their vibration was called dither, from the Middle English verb ditheren, meaning to tremble. Today, when you tap a mechanical meter to increase its accuracy, you are applying dither. My father's explanation for the effect of childbirth on my life: it'll reset all your meters. A trope of. Otherwise known as 8 mechanics or a Fonzarelli fix. In real life, it works best where it works at all when dealing with machines with moving parts capable of being physically jammed or temporarily impeded. gears or switches, hydraulic systems suffering particular kinds of plugs or clogs, fuel lines or sump pumps, or internal components whose function depends on precise alignment and which have become misaligned somehow, vacuum tubes, early transistors, and connection interfaces. All hallmarks of pulp era storytelling, where technology was still a hands-on art. Realistically, it is almost impossible to work with modern delicate electronics or futuristic solid-state circuitry and machinery, but the appeal of a highly emotive and easy-to-show repair technique often wins out over boring technical accuracy. Real-life dithers are disappearing with the rise of digital. Percussive maintenance has become as anachronistic as mixtape references are to the CD and MP3 generation. We still whack the digital DVD player, shake an iPod, or smack the computer screen, perhaps because we want to deny that we cannot dither our way out of a problem, because we want to hope that we have the power to make machines run better, that we can unstick what is stuck. But mostly, we're impotent without analog, dumbed by digital technology that responds only to language, not the rough physical fixes of our 8 mechanics. But maybe dither is different. Maybe it's a storytelling trope because it represents a fundamental human need to be reminded that we are not the victims of our own intelligence, that machines are not our masters. Maybe it also persists figuratively because we live in a rutted world, and at times it's easy to fall into one. Easy to find yourself making the same mistakes over and over again, or sitting in front of a television for an average of 6 hours a day. And we need the occasional whack of percussive maintenance to remind us what a mess it means to be alive. When I approach the neglected fish tank in my son's room, I'm often certain that the blue betta fish is dead. And it's not until I tap the glass that I see any sign of life, the fish darting and zipping wildly around the tank before settling back again into its corner. Is that what I'm circling around? Is this not dither too? Perhaps for the fish. But dither is still there, more significantly, in my pregnant student's Navy pilot husband, tapping his standby attitude indicator on cold mornings before he disappears into the sky. And it's still there simply in the farmer who takes a screwdriver handle to the starter solenoid on his old Ford truck before he rattles off into the fields. In the eternal dream of movies, it's Whoopi Goldberg's fist to the computer and Jumpin' Jack Flash. Dither is magic over logic, sound over sense. It's mystery and madness. It's forever Fonzie's fist hitting the jukebox in Al's Diner and Chewbacca whacking the Millennium Falcon's hyperdrive. It's a big screen kiss, a kick to the shin, Marty McFly's head to the time-traveling DeLorean. It's a slap to the face of the hysterical character, the shake of the shoulders, and the snap out of it screamed. Even if it's a pop culture trope, a storytelling technique whose real-life analogs are fewer and further between, perhaps we'll still be able to find dither or the Fonzarelli fix in the cockpit of an F-18 Hornet, one of the most advanced flying machines ever engineered. On a cold fog morning in Lemoore, California, or on a pitching deck in the middle of an ocean, in the hands of a man with a wife and a baby at home as he taps a finger to his indicator, the percussive sound of human intervention against the indifference of a machined world. An accounting of. I have come to believe that dither is also the spiritual tremble. It's the physical and the mental, the ecstatic agitation of Kierkegaard before God, Thompson before Vegas, or believers before the Virgin Mary, on Jesus, on toast, on tortilla, grill stain, grilled cheese, Lords, and Medjugorje. And it is non-believers too, the secular searchers prostrate before the sublime, quivering breathless before a painting or a sunset or a game-winning shot. It's what the grass does on a windy day, what children do on a playground, but it's also how an essay moves sometimes. Bouncing thoughts around, vacillating between opposing ideas or intentions. And dither can be a metaphorical smack to the face, a fist bump to your rhythm like a ball-peen hammer whacking your clogs loose, freeing up the flow and making the narrative machine work better or smarter somehow. In stories, it's those moments of surprise or grace that O'Connor capitalized on, the epiphanies of Joyce and the razor cuts of Carver and Didion, the blunt, fierce sentences of Hempel or Hemingway, perhaps a sort of emotional bell ring for which this essay reaches but never quite attains. But here is what any storyteller must hope, that a true tremble, an honest dither can be simple, subtle, or sensational. The feeling is what a sentence, an image can do to your head, or what the birth of a daughter does to your internal meters. Dithers are at work around us every day if we tune our instruments to the right frequency, if we tap them before liftoff and let them guide us through the noise. A definition of Stephen, noun, Stefan, stemmen, voice, stimna, stimma, stibna, voice, noise, uproar. Until the 1980s, and longer in some places, it was common practice for the OBGYN, upon delivering a baby into the world, to administer a hard slap to the back or bottom to get the baby to cry, and therefore draw his first breath. The welcome slap, a dither of sorts, was ostensibly meant to help the baby's lungs kick into operation, and the baby's first warbling cry was a welcome sound, one that doctors and parents waited to hear. A silent baby was a troubling baby. A story of my own birth goes like this. My mother punched the doctor for trying to give her drugs she didn't want. Then I was born and I didn't make a sound. Later they brought my mother the wrong baby. She said, "That's not my baby." How do you know? I just know that's not my baby. When they brought her the right baby, I just stared up the room of blue scrubs like a fish, wide-eyed with wonder, and didn't make a sound. There is no record of whether the doctor applied percussive maintenance to me, no story of a slap to the back, a smack to the rump, or a Fonzarelli fix to get me to cry and draw my first breath. There is only the image of my silence, my eyes staring up, like you were just taking it all in, Mom always said. Recent studies have suggested that the percussive maintenance of the newborn slap is vastly overrated, and in fact, potentially detrimental to the baby's ability to breathe normally. Research has shown that babies breathe just fine on their own and simply don't need the doctor's dither. Other research and numerous books have also indicated that it's just not nice to smack a newborn baby. It hurts. Most babies don't like it. Most of them cry and scream when you hit them. Some of them, the troubling ones, simply stare at the offending doctor as if to say, "Don't do that." All of them slap you back. Eventually, every child shakes up the world. First sound of. A story of my daughter's birth goes like this. First, she was a boy. Then she was an arm and a head. Then she was a baby. Then she was a girl. "A baby girl," the young doctor said, finally, riding her stumbles as best she could before the nurse peeked around the curtain and confirmed, "It's a girl." But in a sense, the doctor was right about our baby. She was everything immediately. And while OBs don't smack babies any longer, ours stuck his gloved finger down her throat and wiped her roughly with a towel before handing over the scissors and showing me where to make the symbolic cut, the cut only for ceremony after a cesarean birth. I carried her tiny body across the hall through the double doors past my smiling in-laws into the nursery. The nurses took her from me and laid her down beneath what felt like a fast food heat lamp as they wiped her down, weighed her, measured her, and just generally messed with her. I noticed every other baby in the room, sleeping or eating happily, silent as a picture, but not my girl of noise. I watched her body temperature rise and read digital numbers as she screamed and screamed, clutching her tiny, trembling hands into tight fists, the veins in her face pulsing purple under the skin. She screamed when they pricked her heel for blood tests and screamed when they pressed her inky foot against the paper, and she screamed until they let me hold her close, tucked up against my blue scrubs, and carry her back to her waiting mother. The effect of. In modern sound engineering, dither is an intentionally applied form of noise used to randomize error. It keeps mistakes from becoming permanent ones, like a small fire to keep away the larger ones. For optimal sound, you want generalized agitation plus a localized jolt from time to time. Blue noise makes a good dither. It helps to clean up the speckles of noise, the small errors in translation between analog and digital that can become systemic, widespread, and sound like a whisper or hiss under the mix. When you apply dither with blue noise, it nudges an air out of its rut, unsticks an audio clog, and scatters the impact of unwanted mess. It keeps you from getting stuck in the past or in the in-betweens, keeps your sound true and not too perfect. It keeps the resurrected Wallace Stevens wobbling between the audience and the director, suspended in eternal vacillation. The birth of. Some of us have dithers forced upon us. They fall into our laps when we're just sitting there trying to follow the story. And then some of us make our own dithers and set ourselves a tremble for a lifetime. We have babies. We conceive small motors, little engines of blue noise and chaos to keep the machines agitated, to keep our hearts honest and strong and humming through the air of days. A daughter drops into your life, a second child, and you never stop moving, never take the sound of meters for granted, and time slips past small windows like wispy cirrus clouds, barely noticed as you buzz across the checkerboard landscape of years, the whine of your jets droning white under all that sky. Yeah. Uh-huh. Um, yeah, I mean, as as I was saying earlier last night, I think I write by echolocation. So, to what that means is, I often feel like I'm exploring in the dark, and I'm sort of sending out this signal and seeing what bounces back to me. And I think the way that my brain works is it's sort of a kind of cataloging and collecting of things. And so the form of my essays really mirrors the way I think. And I think that's true of the best essays, that they, and I mean, I don't necessarily think of I see what you mean by the fragmentation. To me, it all makes sense, like, it doesn't seem fragmented to me, but yeah, it's definitely a matter of like, an idea starts to take on this momentum, it's, like when you roll a snowball, it starts out really small and you roll it through, so it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and weirdly shaped. It's never perfectly round. That's sort of what my essays are like, I think. They're like, it starts out with a little snowball that I shove down the hill, and I have to sort of keep up with it. But they're never perfectly shaped. They're always sort of strange in some way. And a lot of what I do in revision is trying to think about the reader and how the reader's going to move through the piece and what I have to do to make that movement make sense in some way, or make the movement at least enjoyable, whether it makes sense or not. Yeah.
I think this is a somewhat related question. You referred to what you were reading as pieces.
Uh-huh.
Is this now? Are we at a moment in the history of prose, or maybe especially nonfiction prose, when we don't have a name?
I guess, yeah. I mean, I think of them as essays, and I could have called them that, but yeah. I mean, as I said this morning to the students, what we call stuff and name things is changing a lot, and I, on some level, believe that the categories that we've created are somewhat false and arbitrary, and that naming something doesn't really help us that much. But that being said, I also really value essays in the form of essays, and so like those pieces that I read are all part of one larger thing, which may be why I call them pieces, because it's, as you saw, there was a lot of overlap between particularly the All of a Dither and Auscultation, and because I think of them honestly as one big essay. So it's like a huge, long, rambling essay, and these are pieces of that essay that I've sent out. I don't know if that makes sense, but and now I'm trying to think about how they all fit together as a book, and how that might work. And, is that answering the question? Okay. Yeah.
Your inspirational, like people that inspired you, authors that inspired you, or is there authors that you do read for inspiration?
Yeah, so authors who inspired me, authors I read for inspiration, the list could go on. We could stay here for a while, but I'll just throw out a few. I mentioned this book earlier today as one that really changed the way I was thinking about writing and books, and it's Maps to Anywhere by Bernard Cooper. It's a wonderful book. Joan Didion's The White Album, I love dearly. David Foster Wallace's first collection of essays, and Consider the Lobster as well, but his first one is a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again. And that book was really important to me. In other genres, I did my MFA in fiction. I firmly believe that all writers should read Amy Hempel. You should read her collected stories, which came out a couple of years ago. She packs more into one sentence, than most people can put in an entire paragraph. Her sentences are like these little diamonds that have been crystallized out of coal. They're just these amazing things. And you can learn so much from reading Amy Hempel. Most recently, right now I'm reading John Jeremiah Sullivan's Pulphead, which is an excellent book of essays, combining some reportage, journalistic kind of stuff, and then some more personal essays. His piece about Axl Rose and Michael Jackson, his pieces are amazing. But the essays in there too are really good. Another writer I've mentioned a couple times since I've been here, who I think you all should read tonight, is Leah Purpura. She has 2 books of essays. The first one is called On Looking. It's a beautiful book of essays that is as much about how we see the world as it is about any particular subject. And then her current book is called Rough Likeness. And Leah is a really interesting writer to me because she, at some level, employs a lot of the tropes and techniques of a kind of classical essayist, where she will tell you right up front what she's doing in the essay, what the project is. It's almost like a thesis statement. From there, though, it's like you've stumbled into an Olympic caliber mental gymnastics class, and you're trying to participate, but not doing so great. But you still want to follow along, because the way her brain moves is totally amazing to me and somewhat terrifying. Sometimes I think it'd be really hard to be her. Everything she sees becomes meaningful. She has an entire essay in On Looking about, she walks past this yard every day and she notices several days in a row a safety pin lying in the grass. That's the subject of the essay. She writes an entire essay about it, and it becomes about so much more than that. So that's a few. Yeah.
Within your essays, and I guess the sections of them, do you vary a lot the tense or the immediacy, the even person, the I or you? And I'm wondering how you decide what choices you're going to make regarding that.
Mm-hmm.
How do you look at it as a whole?
I'll start with sort of how I decide when and where to use the I on the page, because both of these pieces and the stuff I've been working on lately, I've consciously tried to move away from relying too much on the I pronoun. So trying to write things that are, less conditioned by the pronoun, if that makes sense. And so more have a kind of third person, almost objective feel to them, but that are still processed through my consciousness. So, what I hope is that when people are reading like the section about the minds or whatever, that's clearly I'm sort of summarizing some facts and research that I've done, and it has a kind of factual tone to it. But I also try to work in little sort of moments that it's being processed through my brain, and not so much through the I pronoun. As I tell my students, it's the I, this I is more important than this I in nonfiction. And so I've been trying to focus more on that in recent years in my work. I think before I would just sort of rely just habitually or instinctively on the pronoun I. And then as far as tense shifts, that's something I'm very conscious of. In fact, with the auscultation piece, if you notice, the first mind section is in the past tense and the last one is in the present tense. And I went around and around on that actually, and sort of what to do with that. And I think I'd written both of them in the present tense at one point, and then both in the past tense. And it does change it quite dramatically. I mean, the present tense in the last section, what I think creates a kind of immediacy, and that worked in the last section. You know, it's a sort of false present reality, but the effect of it is to make it seem like it's happening right now, or in the moment. And that's, for me, what the present tense does. Sometimes I will write in the present tense initially exclusively, because the present tense has a way of sort of keeping me moving, and rather than sort of letting me wander. So when I know like I have to get something done, I'll write it in the present tense, and then I'll go back and look at it and think about, you know, what it is I want to say and whether it needs to be past tense or present tense. But it's all the product of a lot of revision and thinking about that sort of stuff. In my first book, I have a lot of stuff about my brother and about my dad. And many of the pieces about my dad and my brother and I in our relationship are in the past tense, but all the sections that are focused exclusively on my brother are in the present tense as the book moves forward. The reason for that, and it's not a terribly academic sort of reason, but the book is about the death of my brother. He was killed in a car accident, and I'm writing about that. And so I very intentionally wanted to, sounds sort of cheesy, but bring him to life, you know, in the present tense. I wanted him to live on the page, and before he died. So that's the reason that I do that in that book. Question? All right, thanks. Thank you all.